Peasant life in the Middle Ages was harsh, deprived of the comforts we are accustomed to. No central heating, supermarkets, or emergency services. A roof over one's head meant not just comfort, but survival. And every house was the result of enormous efforts invested in the struggle against nature. The often romanticized images of rural cottages hide the much harsher reality of their construction. It was a process strictly regulated by local resources, collective labor, and a deep, sometimes brutal understanding of the world around them. To survive meant to wrest sustenance from the land and build a shelter from what it provided. There was no room for error. A collapsed roof could mean hypothermia, illness, or even death in the merciless winter. The materials were crude, the methods ancient, but the structures they built served as vital bastions against a hostile world. How, without modern technology, did medieval peasants build houses that served generations and withstood the harsh trials of nature? Watch until the end to find out what secrets these seemingly simple structures hid. The construction of a peasant house in the Middle Ages rarely began with simply digging holes. It was often preceded by complex, though little known, laying ceremonies designed to appease the spirits of the earth and ensure good luck for the future inhabitants. These rituals varied from region to region, but they were united by a deep belief in the animism of nature, its ability to give life and take it away. In some regions, especially in remote and isolated communities, where pagan beliefs intertwined with Christian traditions, there was a tradition of sacrifice to the first log or stone. This did not involve human or large animal sacrifices, but, for example, a handful of grain, a symbol of fertility, harvest, and abundance, might be placed in the foundation pillar, which was to become the support of the entire dwelling, or under the first cornerstone, so that the house would always be full of provisions. Sometimes, if the community was wealthy enough, or if the family wanted to emphasize their prosperity, several copper or even silver coins were laid in the foundation, not to be found later, but as a symbol of prosperity and wealth, intended to attract good luck to the new owners. In more rare and archaic cases, especially where pagan traditions and worship of nature spirits were still strong, they might even use the knuckle of an animal slaughtered on that day, such as a pig or sheep, to tie the house to the fertility of the land and the cycle of life, ensuring that the dwelling would be just as viable and fertile. A pig or a sheep to bind the house to the fertility of the land and the cycle of life, ensuring that the dwelling would be as viable and fertile as nature itself. Sometimes such a laying was made in the very center of the hearth. These actions were not performed out of primitive superstition in the modern sense, but out of a deep, ingrained belief in the living, breathing nature of all things and in the need to maintain a delicate balance with the surrounding world. It was believed that disrupting this balance or neglecting the spirits of the earth could lead to serious misfortunes. Crop failure, famine, disease, sudden destruction of the house by storms, floods, or fires, as well as infertility or poverty of the family. It was believed that if a house was not accepted by the earth, it would be cursed and would never be a happy place. Sometimes to strengthen the future walls and give them special strength and durability, crushed powder from old wood from a destroyed but long-standing house, sometimes even from a centuries-old oak tree, which was considered a symbol of longevity and indestructibility, was mixed into the clay for plastering. It was believed that this would transfer its longevity and memory of the prosperous years and generations that had lived in it. These practices, rarely described in official chronicles and court documents, more often found thanks to archaeological excavations and passed down in oral traditions, reflect the deep, almost mystical connection of the peasant with the natural world and his constant attempts to control the unpredictable through carefully observed rituals. It was not simply a matter of choosing a location and building a house, but literally a contract with the land, concluded through silent, forgotten rituals that formed an invisible but solid foundation for the house and its future. What surprised you most about this deep layer of ancient traditions? Leave your opinion in the comments. After choosing a suitable location for their future home, taking into account drainage, natural shelter from prevailing winds, and access to a water source, the peasants began to build the foundation, which was radically different from modern concrete or stone foundations. Peasant houses rarely had deep, elaborate foundations made of carefully hewn stone or sturdy brick. Instead, they rested on post structures, where vertical load-bearing wooden posts, often made of hardwoods such as oak or elm, were simply driven directly into the ground. In some regions, especially in wetter or marshy areas where standing water was a constant problem, earthen structures with additional moisture protection were used, sometimes including a layer of charcoal or gravel to improve drainage. For more permanent structures, especially in the late Middle Ages, when carpentry skills developed and tools became more sophisticated, stone cushions or support beams were sometimes used. Stone cushions were large flat stones found nearby, which were carefully leveled and laid directly on the compacted ground at the intended locations of the main load-bearing wooden posts. This raised the wood significantly above the damp ground, providing vital natural ventilation and greatly extending its service life by preventing capillary rise of moisture and subsequent rot. The support beams, or sleepers, were horizontal logs, often the thickest and strongest available, which were laid directly on the ground or in a shallow, carefully leveled trench. They formed a continuous foundation for the bottom row of walls, providing a more stable and level platform for the entire wooden frame and helping to distribute the weight of the walls evenly over a larger area, preventing uneven settling. Digging holes for the posts was an extremely laborious task, carried out with primitive but effective tools. Primitive wooden shovels with iron tips and pointed digging sticks. The holes had to be deep enough to ensure stability, usually between 60 and 90 centimeters, and wide enough so that the wooden posts could be firmly installed and then carefully tamped down with earth and stones. This tamping, known as tamping, was done by hand, layer by layer, using heavy wooden tampers or simply large stones to compact the soil around the base of the post as much as possible, creating a solid, supportive foundation. It was crucial to prevent the posts from shifting or sinking under the weight of the structure, especially after seasonal cycles of freezing and thawing of the soil, which could deform less sturdy foundations. The problem was to ensure that all the posts were level and plumb, which was achieved by eye, using simple stone plumb lines on a string, as well as primitive water levels consisting of troughs filled with water. Despite all efforts and thoroughness, a common and persistent problem was the inevitable rotting of these earthen posts due to constant contact with moisture, which required frequent repairs, replacement of individual rotten sections, or even complete reconstruction of the entire house every 1 or 2 generations, making peasant houses a kind of living structure, constantly changing and renewing itself. The house in essence became part of the land, growing directly out of it, but was also inherently vulnerable to its moisture. This direct contact with the soil, while simplifying the initial construction, introduced a fundamental vulnerability that peasants constantly struggled with, finding themselves in an eternal cycle of creation and repair. How did they manage to find, harvest, and process the vast amounts of wood needed for these structures when tools were so primitive and forests often belonged to the Lord and required payment or permission to cut down? The answer is coming soon. When we think of wattle and daub walls, most of us imagine a simple mixture of clay, straw, and water. However, in some regions of medieval Europe, peasants used unusual additives in their clay mixture to significantly improve its properties and extend the life of the walls. One such rare but surprisingly effective ingredient was wood ash from the hearth. Fine, powdery ash, rich in calcium oxide, potassium, and other minerals, was added in small quantities to the clay during mixing. This had several little-known but important effects. First, the ash improved the plasticity of the clay mixture, making it more pliable and easier to apply to the wicker frame. This also helped reduce the formation of deep cracks as the plaster dried, which was critical for the airtightness of the walls and preventing drafts and moisture penetration. Second, and more importantly, ash made the plaster more resistant to moisture and pests. The alkaline properties of ash created an environment less favorable for the growth of mold and fungi, which thrive in damp conditions and could quickly destroy the organic binding elements in the wall. In addition, ash repelled certain types of insect pests, such as woodworms or bark beetles, which could destroy the organic components, straw or small twigs in the plaster, thereby preserving the integrity and strength of the wall for a longer period of time. In some cases, where lime deposits were available nearby, although this was rare for simple peasants as it required a laborious process of extraction and burning lime in primitive kilns at high temperatures, a small amount of slaked lime could be added. Lime, reacting with clay during carbonation, the slow absorption of carbon dioxide from the air, created a primitive but surprisingly effective hydraulic mortar. This mortar became harder and more waterproof when it came in contact with moisture, which was especially valuable for exterior walls exposed to rain and dampness. It was a kind of secret recipe passed down between families or communities, allowing them to create walls that were more durable and weather-resistant than ordinary clay plaster. These alchemical additives, based on thousands of years of empirical experience and a subtle understanding of natural materials, demonstrate the remarkable ingenuity of peasants in using every available resource to improve the quality and durability of their homes. Their knowledge was practical, accumulated through generations of observation and experimentation, rather than theoretical, which made them true folk engineers. The roof was the most critical element of a peasant house, providing essential protection from rain, snow, and wind, as well as playing a role in insulation. Its construction was labor-intensive, physically demanding, and often dangerous, usually relying on straw as the primary roofing material due to its widespread availability and relative ease of processing. The roof was a wooden frame, usually a simple A-shaped frame of rafters converging at the ridge, sometimes supported by internal trusses or longitudinal beams to increase the strength and stability of the entire structure. These logs, often unhewn and roughly fitted by hand with axes and adzes, were then tied together with strong ropes made from plant fibers such as lime bark, hemp, or flax, and sometimes even from processed animal sinews or strips of skin. The slope of the roof was crucial. A steep angle, usually between 45 and 60 degrees, was absolutely necessary for effective water drainage, allowing rain and melted snow to run off quickly and preventing it from being absorbed into the straw, which would lead to rot, mold, and fatal leaks inside the house. In regions with heavy snowfall, the angle could be even steeper to prevent snow from accumulating and placing excessive load on the roof frame. Straw was made from readily available plant materials that could be gathered after harvest from fields or natural water bodies. The most common materials were straw, from wheat, rye, or barley stalks, which produced long, strong stalks, reeds, often collected from swamps and river floodplains, where they grew in abundance, or heather, especially in mountainous and forest-poor areas where other materials were scarce. Reeds, especially long and strong ones, provided the most durable and waterproof straw, capable of lasting up to 50 years when laid correctly, although this required special techniques and high skill on the part of the roofer. Straw roofs made from cereal crops were more common due to their widespread availability, but required more frequent replacement, usually every 5-10 years, depending on the quality of the laying, local weather conditions, and timely repairs. The bundles of straw were carefully prepared, cleaned of impurities and leveled, and laid in dense overlapping layers, starting from the eaves and gradually moving up to the ridge of the roof. Each layer was pressed tightly and secured to the wooden rafters with flexible hazel rods, twisted bundles of willow or woven cords, which were threaded through the layers of straw and tied to the frame. The skill of the roofer was paramount. Incorrectly laid straw would let water through, allowing it to penetrate the house, causing dampness, mold, rot, and ultimately the destruction of the entire wooden structure and rendering the dwelling uninhabitable. The amount of material required was enormous, often requiring the efforts of the entire community to gather, dry, and prepare the straw, and then to lay it, which could take several days or even weeks. This roof was not just a covering, it was a heavy living shell that constantly battled the elements, requiring constant vigilance, regular inspection and repair, and sometimes complete replacement after severe storms or at the end of its service life. But what happened when the fire in the hearth went out and no one had a supply of firewood except those who could afford it? The answer is coming soon. At the heart of every peasant home was a hearth, the central point of domestic life, which served several vital functions: cooking, heating, and lighting. Unlike modern fireplaces with complex chimneys, early medieval peasant hearths were usually very simple. a shallow pit dug directly into the earthen floor or a stone-lined platform, often located in the center of the main room. This design allowed for the most efficient use of heat, which radiated in all directions, spreading evenly throughout the room. There was often no chimney in the modern sense, i.e., a vertical channel for removing smoke to the outside. Instead, smoke from the fire simply filled the upper part of the house, rising to the ridge of the roof, and then gradually escaped through small openings deliberately left in the gables, end walls, through a special smoke vent in the roof itself, or simply seeped through the porous straw roofing. This method of smoke dispersion, although primitive by modern standards, was very effective in retaining heat inside the house, as most of the heat from the smoke remained in the dwelling, which was extremely important during the cold months. In addition, the smoke helped to preserve the straw roofing by covering it with a layer of creosote and soot, which made it more resistant to insect pests such as bark beetles and slowed down decay, extending the life of the roof. The lack of a proper chimney meant that the interior of the house was often filled with a constant haze of smoke, which irritated the eyes and lungs of the inhabitants, causing chronic respiratory problems such as coughing, bronchitis, and mucous membrane irritation. However, this smoke also acted as a natural insect repellent, deterring flies, mosquitoes, and other pests, which was an invaluable advantage in unsanitary conditions and the absence of other means of pest control. In addition, the smoke helped preserve dried meat, fish, cheese, and other foods hung from the ceiling on special beams or hooks, creating a primitive smokehouse and extending their shelf life. The fuel for the hearth varied depending on regional availability, but usually included wood collected from local forests, brushwood, fallen trees, peat from low-lying areas, or even dried animal dung, e.g. cow dung, in treeless steppe regions, where there was simply no other alternative. The fire was rarely allowed to go out completely, as rekindling it with flint, tinder, and tinderbox was a laborious and unreliable process. The coals were carefully raked into a pile and covered with a thick layer of ash overnight to preserve their heat, allowing the fire to be easily rekindled the next morning by simply raking away the ash and adding kindling and small logs. Placing the hearth directly on the earthen floor, often in the center of the room, was a deliberate choice, as it minimized the risk of fire spreading to the wooden structure of the house. Despite the constant presence of smoke and its inconveniences, the hearth was the absolute core of warmth, light, and survival, around which all domestic activities revolved, providing for the family's livelihood and protection from the cold and darkness. The floor in a medieval peasant's house was mostly just the earth itself. It was the simplest and most accessible material, requiring no complex construction or expensive processing. The earth inside the dwelling was compacted and hardened by the constant movement of the inhabitants' feet, as well as by periodic rolling with heavy objects or tampers to create a relatively firm, level, and sufficiently dense surface. This earthen floor was often covered with a thick layer of straw, cut reeds or rushes, which was periodically renewed as it became dirty. This straw covering served several key purposes. It provided a small degree of insulation from the cold, damp earth, absorbed spilled liquids, food crumbs, and organic waste, and offered a softer and more comfortable surface for walking, sitting, and sleeping. When the straw became too dirty, damp, began to rot, or attract insects, it was removed and replaced with fresh straw. Although this replacement was not as frequent as modern hygiene would require, resulting in conditions that would often surprise someone from a cleaner environment accustomed to regular cleaning. Underneath the layer of straw, the earthen floor served as a direct connection to the ground from which the house was built. Water could seep in from below, especially during heavy rains or spring snowmelt, making dampness a constant problem, especially in poorly drained areas or in houses located in low-lying areas. Furniture in a peasant house was minimal and very functional, made from the most readily available materials and often serving multiple purposes. A simple wooden table on trestles could be set up for meals and then dismantled and pushed against the wall to make room for work or sleep. Seating consisted of sturdy stools or long benches along the walls, sometimes with folding backs that could be converted into primitive beds. Sleeping places were often straw mattresses stuffed with dry straw, hay, or leaves, laid directly on the hard floor or on low wooden platforms to raise them slightly above the cold, damp ground. Storage was primitive. Perhaps a few simple wooden chests for clothes, tools, or a few valuable items, as well as shelves or hooks driven into load-bearing posts, or walls for kitchen utensils, tools, and grain bags. The interior of the house was often undivided, consisting of a single room where the entire family, from the youngest to the oldest, lived, ate, slept, and worked, warming themselves by the central hearth. This direct, unfurnished contact with the earth emphasizes the fundamental difference in living conditions and the deep dependence of peasants on the environment and its resources. What did they do when food supplies ran out and winter was just beginning? The answer is coming soon. For centuries, medieval peasants lived under the open sky, which offered little comfort and demanded constant labor. There were no heating bills, grocery stores, or emergency services to smooth out the rough edges of their harsh existence. A roof over one's head was not a commodity. It was a testament to the rough, exhausting efforts against the elements. The popular image of a quaint, rustic cottage often hides the harsh reality of its construction, a process dictated by local resources, communal labor, and a deep, brutal understanding of the forces of nature. Survival meant fighting for food directly from the land and building shelter from the same earth beneath their feet. There was no room for error, no second chances. A collapsed roof could mean hypothermia, disease, or even death in the merciless winters. The materials were primitive, the methods ancient, but the structures they erected stood as vital bastions against a hostile world. How, without modern technology, did medieval peasants build houses that served generations and withstood the harsh trials of nature? Watch until the end to discover the secrets hidden in these seemingly simple structures. Windows and doors in a medieval peasant's house were designed for functionality rather than aesthetics, primarily serving to control the harsh elements and ensure safety. Windows were usually very small, often simply unglazed openings in woven and plastered walls. These small openings minimized heat loss in winter, as heat loss through open openings would have been disastrous for maintaining even a minimal temperature inside, and provided reliable protection from the worst winds, heavy rains, and snowfalls. They were often equipped with simple wooden shutters that could be closed tightly for additional protection from the biting cold, strong winds, or to ensure safety at night from wild animals such as wolves or foxes, or from uninvited guests. Sometimes a semi-transparent material was used to allow a small amount of diffused light to pass through while blocking direct drafts and wind. This could be a thinly stretched animal bladder, e.g. pig or cow, treated and split into thin plates or oiled canvas, which became translucent after being impregnated with linseed oil or animal fat. However, real glass was an unthinkable luxury. Its production was expensive, and transporting fragile sheets of glass was a difficult task, so it was only available to the most noble and wealthy members of society, such as lords or wealthy merchants. The absence of transparent glass meant that the level of natural light inside a room was usually very low, even on the clearest day, making it difficult to carry out any indoor work requiring precision, such as weaving, repairing tools, or cooking, without the constant help of fire from a hearth or primitive candles. Doors were made of heavy wooden planks, often oak or elm, valued for their exceptional strength, density, and durability. These planks were roughly hewn by hand and fastened together with wooden pegs, or, if available and could be made by a local blacksmith, primitive wrought iron nails. Doors were usually hung on simple iron hinges, which were roughly but solidly forged, or, much more commonly and cheaply for most peasants, on rotating wooden pegs that were inserted into the top and bottom of the wooden doorframe, acting as primitive hinges. The doorframe itself was the most important part of the overall wooden structure of the house, providing not only the entrance function, but also the structural stability of the entire opening in the adjacent walls. The protection of the house was primitive but effective for its time. A simple wooden bolt inserted across the door from the inside into special grooves, or a sturdy wooden bolt made from a thick branch, were sufficient to prevent unwanted guests from entering. Real locks with metal mechanisms were rare, and usually found only in the homes of wealthier peasants who managed estates or in manor houses. The door served as the main and often the only entrance for both people and animals, as many peasant houses had a common space for the human family and their livestock, such as sheep, goats, or chickens, especially during the harsh winter months when the animals' warmth helped to heat the dwelling. This direct interaction with the outside world through simple, unfinished openings emphasized the constant struggle against the elements, wild animals, and potential intruders. Each opening was a compromise between the need for light, ventilation, and vital protection. Medieval peasant houses are usually thought of as universal, typical structures created solely under the influence of the availability of materials and functional needs. However, their layout, size, and even the number of functional elements often depended on a little-known but critically important factor: taxes and feudal duties. In some regions, feudal lords and later crowns introduced various forms of taxes linked not only to the land owned by the peasant, but also directly to his dwelling, considering the house to be part of the taxable property. For example, there could be a hearth tax levied on every fireplace where a fire was burning. This meant that peasants had to pay a certain amount of money or give part of their harvest, grain, eggs, poultry, for each hearth in their home, which was a significant burden for an already poor family. There were also taxes on the number of doors or windows, as these were considered a visible indicator of wealth and the size of the house. The more windows and doors, the richer the owner was supposed to be. Although these taxes were not universally widespread throughout Europe and varied in severity, they had a serious impact on the architecture of peasant dwellings, often shaping their appearance more than aesthetic preferences or even basic comfort. To avoid excessive levies and conserve as much of their meager resources as possible, peasants might deliberately build houses with a minimum number of hearths, even if the family was very large and required more heat and convenience for cooking. A large family might huddle around a single hearth to avoid double or triple taxation. This led to more cramped, less divided, and less functional interior spaces. Similarly, they tried to limit the number of windows and doors, making them smaller and placing them sparingly, which directly affected the natural lighting and ventilation of the dwelling. This resulted in more enclosed, dark, and less comfortable spaces than would have been possible without such fiscal constraints. Moreover, some tax systems levied a tax on area under roof or on the number of floors, encouraging the construction of more compact and lower buildings. This encouraged the construction of single-story compact houses, even if expanding the space or building a second level, e.g. for storing grain, straw, or sleeping children, would have been very useful for a growing family or household. Thus, not only the availability of materials, the characteristics of the landscape and community traditions, but also the invisible yet tangible burden of feudal laws and taxes dictated the form, size, and even the internal organization of peasant dwellings, turning every architectural choice into a forced economic decision. It was a constant compromise between the family's immediate needs for comfort and space and the relentless demands of the Lord, the burden of which was hidden within the walls of their home and affected every aspect of their daily life. Want to know how they kept warm without knowing what heating was? You're about to find out. The construction of a peasant house depended entirely on simple, often locally made hand tools and methods that maximized efficiency through collective effort and a deep understanding of natural materials. The main cutting tools were axes, used for felling trees, trimming logs, and splitting firewood. There were different types of axes, each with its own specific purpose. Large, heavy axes with long handles for initial tree felling and primary trimming of large trunks, as well as smaller, thinner axes used for more precise woodworking, creating grooves, spikes, and other connecting elements. In addition to these, axes with blades perpendicular to the handle were used, which were ideal for leveling flat surfaces of logs. Saws were less common in the early Middle Ages due to the complexity of their manufacture, the high cost of metal, and the labor-intensive sharpening process. When they were present, they were usually large, two-handed pit saws that required two people to operate. One stood on the log, while the other was in a pit below it. Such saws were used for rough sawing of logs into boards directly at the construction site, rather than for fine carpentry work, for which axes were more commonly used. For digging the ground, digging holes for support posts and trenches for foundations, Peasants used simple shovels with wooden, or less commonly, iron tips, as well as pointed digging sticks, which were particularly effective for loosening dense soil and removing stones. Hammers were simple wooden mallets or heavy stones used to drive wooden pegs, compact joints, or tamp the earth around support posts. Knives were ubiquitous and multifunctional tools used for everything from cutting plant fibers for ropes to trimming wattle for walls and scraping wood. Ropes and levers, often made from sturdy branches or the trunks of young trees, were essential for moving heavy logs and frame elements. Farmers used basic principles of physics, such as levers and inclined planes, to increase their human strength and move objects that weighed much more than one person could lift. The accuracy of the square and level was often determined by eye by an experienced craftsman, using simple plumb lines, a stone tied to a rope, or primitive water levels, which were wooden troughs filled with water, the surface of which was used to determine the horizontal. The absence of iron nails, especially in the early periods and for poor peasants, meant that logs and beams were joined using complex tenon joints, a protruding part that fits into a corresponding hole, such as a dovetail for a strong bond, or a slanted tenon for beams, which were then secured with wooden pegs, wooden nails or trunnels, driven into drilled holes. Wattle for walls was woven by hand from flexible branches, such as willow or hazel, intertwining them between vertical posts, and the clay coating was applied and smoothed by hand, often with bare hands. This dependence on basic tools and primitive technologies meant that complex and durable structures were achieved not through advanced inventions or mechanization, but through the accumulation of practical knowledge, thousands of repetitive movements, and the collective labor of families and communities. Every cut, every joint, every layer of plaster was the product of human effort, endurance, and traditional wisdom, passed down through observation, direct apprenticeship, and repeated imitation from older to younger generations. The construction of a peasant house was rarely an individual endeavor. It was fundamentally a communal undertaking, evidence of the deep need for cooperation and mutual aid in medieval society. Although an individual family could prepare some materials, such as gathering straw or small branches for wattle, the actual construction of the heavy wooden frame, digging deep holes for posts, and the laborious process of plastering the walls and roof often required the coordinated efforts of many neighbors, friends, and sometimes the entire village. This informal system of mutual assistance, known as communal labor, or B, was a cornerstone of rural life, especially during periods of large projects. The rationale behind this approach was simple and pragmatic. A sturdy, stable home for one family benefited the entire community, contributing to the overall stability, prosperity, and productivity of the village as a whole. When a new house was being built or an existing one needed major repairs, people would gather together, bringing their tools, skills, and physical labor. Men chopped trees, trimmed logs, and lifted heavy beams. Women and children could gather and bind straw for roofing, mix clay plaster, or prepare branches for weaving. Experienced craftsmen, carpenters, roofers, supervised more complex and responsible tasks, such as building the wooden frame or laying the straw. Food and drink, often prepared from the most modest supplies, were provided by the family building the house, turning hard work into a kind of social event that strengthened community ties. This collective effort not only distributed the enormous physical burden that was impossible for one family to bear, but also facilitated the vital transfer of knowledge and building techniques from generation to generation. It ensured that essential skills were preserved in the community and that no family was left without shelter due to a lack of individual strength, experience, or resources. Thus, the house was not just a private dwelling, but a tangible product of community solidarity, reflecting the deep intertwining of lives and the common struggle for survival in the harsh medieval world. The construction of a medieval peasant's house was a profound exercise in pragmatism and collective survival. From the careful selection of the site to the collective efforts of the community, every aspect of construction was dictated by necessity and available resources. These dwellings, often primitive by modern standards, were marvels of empirical engineering, using local materials and ancient methods to provide vital shelter from the unforgiving elements. The reliance on earth, wood, and straw reveals a deep, if unscientific, understanding of the properties of materials and environmental factors. These houses were not just structures, they were the physical embodiment of a harsh existence, a constant battle with nature, and an unbreakable community bond. What amazes you most about the methods and materials used by medieval peasants to build their homes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more insights into the unvarnished realities of the past.